It's just after I see a movie, I like to go get a piece of pie and talk about it. It's sort of a little tradition I have. Do you like to get pie after you see a good movie?
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to A Piece of Pie, the queer film podcast. I'm your host, Brian Rowe, and I'm here once again with Max and our first-time guest, Nick. Hey, Nick. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Max asked you to come on because he and I have been talking about this pairing for a while, and specifically Hitchcock for a while. And he was like, well, I know someone who really loves Hitchcock and is familiar with the Patricia Highsmith novel that Strangers on a Train is based on. So having not read the book myself, it's nice to have someone who has read it on to kind of like compare and contrast, because that's always sort of fun. And the movies, like I said, which you probably already know if you click the link, the movies are Rope and Strangers on a Train, two seminal sort of Hitchcock classics that also deal not so subtly with homosexuality, which is why we're discussing them on the Queer Film Podcast. Do one of you want to like start us off with Rope and kind of talk about what that's about?
I'm happy to give a little bit of a summary, Brian, but also thank you for coming, Nick. Nick is my go-to friend when it comes to the classic movies, but I also know we're a big fan of coded queer villains, and within both of these movies, definitely not so coded. As we were just discussing beforehand, too, movies that share a lot of similarities, and including cast members. But we're going to start with Rope. Quick rundown on Rope was that it came out in 1948. It is infamously known as one of the first one-take movies, although it is separated into 10 separate shots, and roughly follows and ripped from the headlines from Leopold and Loeb, but follows two young Harvard graduates, Brandon and Philip, played by John Dahl and Farley Granger, as they strangle their former classmate to death at the beginning of the movie and put him in a chest, and then invite everybody over for dinner. And then basically the movie takes place more or less in real time over the rest of this macabre dinner party, where their main guest is their former school housemaster and teacher, Rupert Cattle, played by James Stewart. That is basically the whole movie, planning this perfect murder and then the pride and homosexual bickering that happens in between. This was my favorite Hitchcock movie when I was a kid, one of the first ones that I saw. I think for a lot of clear reasons that a lot of young theater gays and theater kids really loved this one. Nick, how'd you first come upon Rope?
Yeah, similar to you, I loved this one when I was a kid. I will say it was not my favorite in the way that it may have been for you, but I was a theater kid. I was a young gay. I sort of had this moment in my early teens where I was doing this like deep dive into Hitchcock, and this deep dive that sort of then led me also into, reading a lot of crime fiction, reading, Highsmith as we'll talk about later. But, this one had sort of like a mystique for me at the time. This was a time when it was still kind of challenging to access copies of rare and obscure things. So it took me a while to actually track it down. By the time I watched it, I knew like, oh, it's the trickiest of Hitchcock movies. It's full of like technical, like bravado and making a meal out of the limitations that he has. So, and also, the gay stuff, I knew I was going to get into it for the gay stuff. So I was really, really happy. I remember watching this for the first time and just sort of seeing how all those pieces that I'd heard rumored coming together. And yeah, so this is actually the first time that I had watched it, or that I have watched it since that time, close to 20 years ago at this point. So I was really happy to see how well it actually held up. I wasn't sure what to expect from it, but it hit a lot of the right buttons for me.
So this is definitely a blast from the past for you. Yeah. I tend to think that this one is one that's grown in reputation even more than almost all of his other films, and has been more influential, and obviously more directors that chase those one-shot films, Birdman winning the Oscar a few years back, obviously influential on Alfonso Cuarón and others. And for the real reason, when they started asking Hitchcock, why'd you do this? He stopped having an answer. He was basically just wanted to show off. There was no real reason for this to take place like this, other than it wanted the momentum, it wanted this real-time feeling that a play had. And it was based off of an earlier play that was apparently much more gay, but they knew pretty early would not get past the Hays Code or Hollywood censors.
Yeah, I definitely think it's worth discussing the Hays Code, particularly in reference to this movie, because so much of why it's subtle and why it's arguable, I suppose, on how subtle it is, but the reason it's not plainly stated is because of the Hays Code. So they had to, the Hays Code, of course, being a list of rules, I believe it started in the early 30s, that films had to follow, basically, to get a wide release by Hollywood studios, because Hollywood was afraid that if you showed gay men in a movie or you showed a murder in a movie, that now people are going to be inspired to be gay or they're going to kill somebody. So it was this really early on, like, sort of conservative movement of like movies are inspiring violence, and it predates, like video games create violence and all of that. So, but it was around for about a decade and a half, and it really is the reason that a lot of movies, a lot of like the Tennessee Williams movies had to kind of cut out all the gay stuff because, obviously gay people didn't exist in the 30s, so they couldn't be in movies.
But like so many things with the Hays Code and around this era, it made things gayer. It took away, and this is where I think Hitchcock started to, a lot of his villains had been queer coded up to this point, but now he really wanted to push the envelope. Now he was really getting a taste for the controversy and working with his actors and being explicit. We'll get to Strangers on a Train much later, where he worked very closely with Robert Walker on getting around the code. But with this one, like, the movie really doesn't dance around it too much. In fact, it's quite clear that these two men are within a sexual relationship and probably also had sex with Jimmy Stewart. So I was lucky enough also to catch a double matinee of both Rope and Strangers on a Train at the Music Box in 2007 with Farley Granger there. So I did get the opportunity to meet him. He had just come out with his autobiography called Include Me In, where he came out as bisexual. And so I just remember all the audience questions being very focused on how much they could get away with, what undercover gay Hollywood was like. And it was nice to see that Farley, before he unfortunately passed away a few years later after that, was willing to give up some of the good stories.
Oh, I love that. I didn't know that, that you had gotten, did you, I guess you probably didn't meet him, but you were probably, did you ask any questions or?
Oh, no, I've always been too afraid to ask a question at Music Box, or more happy for people who are a little bit more obsessive to come up and ask something more interesting. I'm the kind of person who probably just waves over when they're in the lobby afterwards and when he was signing his book.
Yeah, that's fun. I'm sure I've told you the story about standing next to Catherine Keener at the Music Box. But I'll not get into that here because it's not that important. But I wanted to mention, because you were talking about how they're very clearly lovers. The movie opens right as they are killing that guy, and they dude lights a cigarette and looks like I used to be a smoker. I know that that post-coital cigarette look.
Yeah, that's exactly how they staged that.
Exactly. And then he's like, they open the windows.
And they're in the dark, and yeah.
Yeah, it is the most sexual moment in a movie that is quite actually filled with them. And a lot of the staging is like that. And a lot of the staging has them face to face, almost mouth to mouth, in this really intimate way that two straight men probably wouldn't stand and interact. I was reading about it. The play, it seems, had the chest that the body is in the center of the stage, and the play happens around it. And Hitchcock's sort of idea to translate that was to shoot it all like it's one shot, to give you the sense that you're there. And the chest is in shots quite a bit, but it obviously isn't always present. But the idea was that you were always aware of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that I've been overusing this term on the podcast as of late, Brian, but I can't help it. Both of these movies are still Freudian nightmares. And what you just described is, again, where it's like, it's more insinuous, it's more queer, that like you've got two movies focused on choke play and then smoking a cigarette afterwards. So just all of these, very fancy dandy men with their oral fixations. And Nick and I joke, our favorite type of queer coded villains are the ones that are like throwing little purses of pennies and being like, watch the girl, and report back.
Yeah, it's the article on the Toast. It's forever my favorite. Signs that you're in a homoerotic subplot in a mid-century film, and things, like blackmail is such an ugly word, isn't it? And I'd do anything for my friends, wouldn't I? You are taking off your gloves very slowly.
Well, I mean, these two movies are like in the spotlight for that,
Oh, absolutely.
And I think you've got North by Northwest after this. You've had some of his other films beforehand, but like these have got to be the two most like popular gay villains or queer coded villains in all of American cinema.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate that they're treated with such sort of disdain and fear. I mean, obviously, these are characters that are murderers, but when you take the two films together, in each case, you know, it's constantly about this like, we have to find and enact the perfect murder. It's about like getting it exactly right. And in both cases, they really seem to view it as a right that they have as privileged white people, frankly. And Rope in particular, they're consistently talking about how, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but it's basically like, you know, yeah, men of high society like should be allowed to do this once in a while.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too. One of the other things that I noticed was in both films, they're also really focused on their hands. There's this whole scene in Strangers on a Train where his mother is giving him a manicure. And then there's multiple lines of dialogue in Rope about how his hands are going to make him famous because he's a pianist. And it's this really interesting, especially watching them so closely together, you get the sense that Hitchcock really just sort of viewed homosexuals as like homicidal, high society. I don't even know what the word is, but you get the sense that Hitchcock really viewed homosexuals as this sort of high society snobs that were killing people almost out of spite. And it's really interesting to watch that with, like I said, watch them so close together like that.
Well, let's just break open this question right now. Was Hitchcock a homophobe? Nick, what do you think?
Oh my God. So I definitely came into this wanting to unpack sort of this question. What does Hitchcock maybe feel about queer folk? I don't know. There are so many examples across his filmography. You've got your Mrs. Danvers, you've got your Martin Landau in North by Northwest.
His women's intuition.
his women's intuition. I feel like there is something these ones absolutely feature gay villains. I am going to tentatively make an argument or put forth an argument that this also features gay protagonists, certainly in the form of Farley Granger, who I do think certainly in Strangers on a Train, and I think in a slightly more sort of subtle and insidious way in Rope, is sort of the focus of the audience's sympathies, and I do think that's interesting. And of course, it's very, very a Code era. You know, it has a little more to do with sort of the nature of, you know, the constant threat of exposure that someone who was living as a somewhat open gay person at that time might have been living through. And so that is sort of what complicates it for me, you know, beyond the sort of like the high-flying monster that is Mrs. Danvers and the sort of equally, like not even equally, but like more so monstrous figure of Brandon in Rope and Robert Walker in Strangers. Yeah, I think that it's so complex that I can't really quite pin down where his sympathies are, to the extent that I sort of wonder whether for Hitchcock, maybe it's just like a style thing. You know, here are all of these like effete, fancy, upper class snobs, you know, or very, very spooky and butch women who are sort of nosing around being evil and creating mischief and thinking themselves above everything. You know, how much is he aware, I guess, of what he is doing versus is he sort of like capturing on larger cultural ideas and ideas of who a gay person is and who an evildoer and a criminal is, and sort of marrying it together in a way that's sort of more aesthetic than it is social. Mm-hmm. Obviously, of course, then the impact of that is much more far-reaching than whatever the intent is. But that's my stab at that. What do you think?
Is there a Hitchcock film where there is a queer character that is not a villain?
The Birds.
Is there a queer character in the...
There is a queer character in The Birds.
The
school teacher. The school teacher is clearly a lesbian.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of critics also think that Tippi Hedren herself might be somewhat queer-coded and this outsider coming into the community and bringing all these birds with her too. But I think Nick's right Otherwise, it just mainly runs the gamut to be very, patriarchal and and those are the people still nominally at the center of a lot of Hitchcock films. But Nick, I thought that was a very thorough and interesting response because I kind of split the difference myself too. Is that clearly Hitchcock is kind of a monster. I mean, like we know all the stories behind Hitchcock.
We know everything, yeah.
We know everything,
but not enough.
Unfortunately, he is a misogynist. Unfortunately, he tortured his women. Unfortunately, he tortured Ruth Roman and in Strangers on a Train coming up. He is a bully. He obviously had a lot of hate in his heart. And I think, as a rich and powerful white man within Hollywood and Britain and everything else, that speaks to a little bit of that core.
Absolutely.
But the other part of it is, I think that he really likes these characters. Hitchcock's queer villains and queer-coded villains tend to be the best characters in all of his films and tend to be the most memorable and tend to, be the secret protagonists within their own roles. Mrs. Danvers, like you said. But these are the two films where he knows the audience sympathies are going to be with his queer characters. He knows that the audience is going to like Bruno more than it likes Guy. He knows that the audience does want to see if Brandon and Philip can get away with it. And that Jimmy Stewart is actually he's kind of a spoil sport. So I think that there is this showman and circus quality in him that knows a fun character or a cool character.
Sure.
I think the same as a lot of Disney, when you look through its history though too. It's just kind of like, oh, would you rather be the boring protagonist or would you rather be the fabulous Fawk?
Look at how they're dressed.
And of course, and this is where I think, decades and decades later, you see audiences that, side much more with the villains than they do any type of boring white guy nominal heroes at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's left us a really fascinating legacy of really compelling, like screen queer characters and off-screen queer characters as well. I always, to go back to the Rebecca example, I always have to include Rebecca herself, who is, the best queer women in film. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, he left us such a fascinating legacy, and some of it is so difficult. Norman Bates, I think, being the worst example, but some of these other just sort of very fabulous, very dramatic, very quippy, very witty George Sanders types. I think it's a really hard legacy to really ignore and challenging to unpack, but worth doing.
A double-edged sword, I think,
yeah.
Really at the base of it.
I think personally, my answer to is Alfred Hitchcock a homophobe my answer is yes. I think that he, like I said, I was surprised to learn there was a lesbian in The Birds. I haven't seen The Birds in probably about 20 years by now, so I do need to revisit that. They're, like I said, like we've talked about, that's like the reason that we're pairing them. They're queer coded, but they're murderers, they're sociopaths, and they're trying to commit the perfect murder, and that's a game to them. And I have to imagine that Hitchcock, having done a lot of stage production before he got into film and also doing a lot of film, not to generalize, but I have to imagine he worked with queer people quite often. And it just seems, I feel like making them queer killers and these sort of like sociopaths, sort of a dandy,
Yeah.
I think that he views them with contempt. But that said, I also think that he, like we talked about with Rope, most of the suspense of Rope comes from, are they going to get away with this? And like when they start moving, like the stakes start to like really rise when he like puts all the candlesticks out there and he announces, he's like, oh, we're going to make this the centerpiece now. Like the tension is ratcheting up because he knows the audience sympathies lie with them. They're trying not to get caught and he's just sort of flaunting it. But I do think, like I said, I think he kind of views them with contempt.
I think that's a funny question, Brian. I think that they might want to get caught. And I think that gets into a little bit more of the queer codedness of all of this too. And, some of this is just going to be what the story is too. It came from the play that was a lot more queer. It's ripped from the headlines. This was pretty notorious. And so anything attached to this story is still going to come with that public knowledge of, killer homosexuals. And so I do think that the movie quite grapples with it, but I also think it has this lasting power. It's become, I think the most lasting of all of Hitchcock's cult hits or audience favorites, because it's what I saw when I saw it when I was 12 years old. I was just like, hey, that's me. This is something that's a lot more clear and something that's a lot more weird and a lot more fun and a lot more Addams Family macabre than any type of drippy dramedies that were coming out of like the 80s or the 90s. I'd rather take 100 Ropes over Philadelphia, And I think that I say that often, Brian, but I mean that especially here. Give me a queer villain before, a boring golden idol any day of the week.
I think that's a fair comparison when talking just in terms of just the movies and whether or not that makes the movie good or not. But I also think that when you factor in sort of the time and what was going on in the world with Rope and the Hays Code, it just feels to me like more purposeful, I guess, on Hitchcock's part to make these people villains. I understand what you're saying, and yes, I would watch. I think Rope is a fantastic movie, and I would absolutely watch that over Philadelphia any day. But I think the message he was trying to get across, other than it's like the suspenseful story that he's telling, is that watch out for these faggots.
Yeah, I mean, I think like that is such like a through line in like the crime fiction of this time and the noir films. There are so many dangerous gay people. And it's all sort of filtered through. Like Maltese Falcon. Like for my money, 3 of the best gay villains on screen, but Humphrey Bogart has no interest in them. Dashiell Hammett, the writer, is really writing them for laughs. For us, the reader, who are presumably, or he is presuming, is not gay, to really hate them. Not to find anything redeeming or interesting or compelling in them besides just sort of like a social attitude of hatred. So I absolutely do see like where you're coming from, Brian. That's the way, the legacy of how gay people are depicted in this form of storytelling, and the way that has sort of informed how we've criminalized queerness throughout history as well, and sort of like how those things have fed on each other, does make me feel really skeptical. For as much of like a noir and crime aficionado as I am, I'm always trying to read on a couple of different levels or view on a couple of different levels. And the double consciousness of that gets hard some days.
Mm-hmm. Nick, that's just a great point. For as much as I love this movie and the next one, though, too, it is something when I revisit them, I struggle with being kind of like, yeah, that's great. Did this help codify the shortcut for queer equals villain for decades to come? Did this back real laws and real audience prejudices for a long time? Mm-hmm. That's probably true. Happy to look back in this time machine and go kind of like, that's fun. That's some fun to see a gay main character. That's fun to see. Right. I'd rather be, Ursula rather than, Ariel. But did it really have like that big of an impact? And that's, I think it's hard to still struggle with that today without just looking at it for the camp value.
Yeah. Well, at least we know that Rope was a flop.
Yes. Well, and a big string of flops. This was
his flop period.
Low time for Hitchcock.
It was also banned in many cities throughout the country because of its queer content. You were talking earlier though about whether or not they wanted to get away with it, and I wanted to kind of touch on that. Because I wanted to talk about the dynamic between Brandon and Philip, because it seems to me that, like, my reading of it is that, yeah, Brandon is super into it and up for it, and Philip isn't really, but he's turned on by the idea that Brandon is into it and turned on. Like, he's sort of enabling him. And when they invite Rupert James Stewart to the play, that is very much Brandon wanting to. He almost says it, where he's like, "Oh, it'll up the ante if he's here because of what we did this because of what he said. So if we up the ante, like I think he wants to get found out specifically by Rupert, and I think he wants to show Rupert like, look, this thing you talked about, like we did this, and I really think in some weird level, like I do think they had some sort of relationship together. And before we move on to Strangers, I want to talk about the miscasting of James Stewart. But
yes, the James Stewart of it all.
Oh, yeah. You're breaking my heart.
But I do think that was I think that was sort of Brandon's sort of end game, was he wanted to do this to show off to Rupert, and maybe in some way, like maybe get Rupert back or something like that.
Mm. Yeah, there was a very like Prime of Miss Jean Brodie type relationship with them, like the very influential, very the adult authority figure who can really get into your brain when you're impressionable and tell you what's good and what is not. That's fascinating, and that is, I think, a huge part of why I think, like, I agreed with you so fervently the miscasting of Jimmy Stewart. I don't buy him as like a malicious educator who wants to get to get young people on his side with his sort of proto-Nietzschean ideas. I absolutely buy him at the end when he has his, like, change of heart, and you killing this person made me not a Nazi anymore, change of heart. And like that feels very like, Frank Capra, James Stewart that we know and love. But
yeah, that self-righteous,
Right.
like speech at the end where he's like,
Mhm.
"You're gonna die."
Right.
Yeah, it's 1948. There's nothing morally gray about Jimmy Stewart yet. It would be another decade until Vertigo.
Right. And I don't even buy him as morally gray in Vertigo, but it's a different
Yeah.
podcast.
True. Well, he's the housemaster in this one. And I love all of these, very gay terms that keep getting bandied about, and these brotherhood and Harvard. It's another film about Hitchcock's obsession with dominance too, but this is about like gay characters. And so it definitely still whiffs of that type of straight man understanding of like, well, who's the man and who's the woman? Like the film obviously plays a lot with like, who's the top, who's the bottom. Actually, it's not that coy. It's basically like Brandon's the top and Philip's the bottom, and he's going to have a moral nosebleed about it, but he wants to make Brandon happy, and set the table, and he'll just go along with the murder too. And it's definitely old fashioned, and it's definitely from that mentality, but it's also kind of sweet in a twisted way. Maybe I found it very sweet when I was 12 years old, and that explains a lot about me.
All right, I'll remember that next time I'm at a dinner party at your place. I'm going to be checking all the cabinets. Yeah, like I said, I do think that dynamic is there. And it is, like you said before, it's straight from the play. That was another thing that I learned when I was reading about it, is in the play, Rupert is the same age as them. And they all just went to school together, which would have made a lot of sense had they not cast Jimmy Stewart, like if they had cast literally anybody else. But also, famously, Jimmy Stewart, being like this conservative Christian, didn't want to play up the gay aspects and didn't want to play it as if he had that relationship with them. And so, like the scene, like we talked about at the beginning, stuff like that, he refused to be shot like that and to be blocked like that, to give that impression. And in fact, there's a scene where he's like leaning in really close to a woman, almost as if for the audience to be like, Jimmy Stewart's not one of these guys.
I mean, he just sort of has this attitude throughout of like not playing along. And I think like he disguises it well in like his acting choices, where like it's how he's reacting to the other people in the room. I mean, there's that marvelous conversation where two of the women at the party are talking about the famous stars that they think are sexy. And he's just sort of in the middle of them and is trying to like make fun of their conversation. James Mason and Cary Grant and all these people that, Hitchcock worked with.
A little meta moment.
But he just like, James Stewart just sort of has this moment where he clearly feels so threatened by this conversation that the character needs to make fun of them for being ridiculous in that moment. And that didn't land so well for me. It made me feel very disappointed in James Stewart.
It's why you want them to get away with it. Rupert is such a drip.
Right.
I don't know about all this murder. Well, that came out bad. That was more like
do more of it.
That was him in Anatomy of Murder.
Can we talk about Arthur Lawrence just briefly?
Yes.
Because I do feel as though, it's come up, when did Hitchcock have gay collaborators, and how might that have impacted? And I do feel, in a way similar to how I feel about Strangers on a Train, Arthur Lawrence, famously openly gay at this time, did the screenplay for this. I do always sort of wonder how that sort of level of collaboration sort of impacts or at least like muddies what we think might be going on. I love Arthur Lawrence, by the way. I just love Arthur Lawrence, and I'm very happy that he is part of this creative team. Watching him in the Celluloid Closet recently talking about this film, sort of making the argument that, the part of why Hitchcock wanted to do these long takes and do this experiment in this particular way was so that the gay stuff couldn't really be reshot or like objected to by the censors, how they like so studiously kept it out of the script, put it into the performances, and then made it so that reshoots would be really difficult and time consuming. I feel like that's an interesting perspective and an interesting, primary source.
There's your answer to your question then. as to why it was shot like this. I'd spent so long from that scene in the celluloid closet that I didn't remember that. But that's a great quote. There was another quote that he had where he was basically something to the effect of, there's not a line where it's not intentional. Like, they never mentioned the sexuality or the homosexuality, but there's not a line that wasn't designed to show it in some way. Like, they wrote everything coded, specifically because of the Hays Code, which, by the way, I looked up, and it was active for 34 years, which was way longer than I had said earlier. So I want to make that correction. And it was from 34 to 68, just so I'm not giving out wrong information on my podcast. But yeah, it was almost like a game to them, like a challenge, where they were like, let's see what we can get in. And I would argue too, like, yeah, well, this was sort of a period of downtime for Hitchcock in terms of his success, but he's probably the only filmmaker of the era that could have gotten away with it.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up to Nick, that Arthur wrote the screenplay, The Man Who Would Go to Gypsy and West Side Story, and La Cage aux Folles, but he was also in a relationship with Farley Granger, a secret one. So this was one where, I do think Rope is a movie that's always going to be a little bit at odds with each other. It's one that's obviously made by a lot of queer artists that camped it up as much as they possibly could, and a bunch of uber straight artists that, turned their nose down on it, like Hitchcock and Stewart. But this is the one where I think the faggots win. I think that, the lasting power of this movie isn't because Jimmy Stewart, stopped the evil gay men. It's because it's this weird and this gay, and they almost got away with it. And it's watched by people and aging millennials like us. But to be fair, this was a favorite of a lot of other kids in high school at the time too. If you can believe it, this was an attempt by two of my straight friends in high school to do their own film version of it, to recreate Rope in their basements and to get these takes done. And the other film that we tried to recreate that got much further along was the Philadelphia Story. So those were two straight guys. So there's something to this story that I think is just such an appeal to the old theater kids and musical fans and camp classic and cult classic type of audience that keeps this one alive, maybe a little bit more than something like Strangers on a Train, which is obviously still beloved, but is a bigger critical hit, was a big box office hit, stands along his pantheon and some of his best directed movies, whereas this one is so much more restricted. I think he got himself into this box of this long take, and is quoted over and over again for saying that he thinks that, it was an experiment that didn't work out. He considered this one a failure for a very long time. And Nick, I think that you mentioned this was a lost one of the fabled lost Hitchcock films for a long time.
Hard to find.
His daughter had to buy it back. And, Patricia Hitchcock, who we'll get to in Strangers on a Train momentarily.
Yeah, I think that there's something, I alluded to this a little bit, the experimentalness of it. Like, I think it, especially if you're young, like, it can hit a very particular part of your brain where, like, oh, wow, this was the first time anybody tried doing an entire film in one take. I have to see it, I think that there's like that's maybe not universal, but like for those of us whose brains are made up of like equal parts trivia and movie quotes,
our audience well then, Nick.
Like it's very alluring, sort of, no matter who you are beyond that.
And again, this was before Russian Ark. This was obviously before Birdman. This was before Children of Men. So
that's putting it mildly.
Yeah. When I saw this as a kid, it was before all of those things though too. So it was something that was just like, oh, this is fairly mind-blowing, before directors started to make this type of experiment a lot more commonplace. But that's what I do think it lifts it up as one of Hitchcock's more modern films, is because, this is this director obsession now to get the perfect take in one take, or to push cinema to where it goes. And really you're looking at the sui generis here.
Yeah, I actually remember when I first saw this film, it was on VHS when I was in college, and I rented it not because of the gay stuff, but because of the one shot. And yeah, obviously that was well before any of those films came out. But it was also, obviously, it goes without saying, well before the advent of digital photography, which now makes that kind of shot so much easier. And now we've seen it in music videos, we've seen it on TV shows where it's actually one shot. Of course, like the long takes like that Scorsese does or Paul Thomas Anderson does. But I remember when, I don't remember the name of the movie, that's on the tip of my tongue, but it was a Mike Haggis film, and it was shot with 4 separate cameras all consecutively. Time Code, yes.
Yeah,
That
I love
was
that.
that was the first time that I feel like it was the first time, if memory serves, they were like, this is the first time since Rope since this has been attempted.
Mhm.
And I remember that being kind of a big deal.
Well, and tell you the truth, I find the cuts in Rope like very endearing. There's something better than like CGI smoothing out the shots in Birdman or where you're really looking for it. Whereas this movie is just like, yep, I bumped up against his suit coat and now I'm pulling back. Like it's nice. It's classical in that type of makes you think like a theatrical play, an acts or a radio play, and this one comes in. You know, no shot is more than 10 minutes, obviously, because that's the length of a film can. But most of them are in between 6 and 8. So it's just like this story is bite-sized and I think is, again, influential for what we get from bingeable TV and a lot of other things moving forward. It's an experiment that Hitchcock might have thought didn't work out then, but obviously is reaping its benefits now.
Yeah, that's a great point. And according to the Internet Movie Database, there's actually a shot. One of the shots that's in the film, I looked for it because I read it before I saw the movie, and I wasn't able to find it. But one of the shots, the camera rolls over someone's foot, and he broke his foot, and he was like muffled and carried off the stage. But that shot is in the movie. I think I found one that looked the most like it was bumping into something, and but I don't know for a fact. It's right after it pans down to the candles when they're talking about the place setting at the beginning of the movie, and then it pans back. It kind of jostles a second, and I don't know, but I think that might be the shot where.
Well, turn the volume up. See if audio got in there. I was looking up that trivia too, and there's another one that I didn't catch, but apparently somebody puts a glass on a table and it falls off, and a stagehand grabs it.
Oh, I missed that.
Or it hits the ground. So
I remember that in the trailer or the trivia, but I missed that too. Yeah. Anybody have anything else on Rope, or should we move on to the other Hitchcock, Strangers on a Train?
I'm ready to talk about game and watching tennis.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, we'll check out
tennis match ever.
We'll check out the trailer for Strangers on a Train, and we'll see you on the other side.
Two fellows meet, like you and I. No connection between them whatsoever. Each one has somebody that he'd like to get rid of. So, they swap murders.
Fantastic, isn't it? You didn't know when Bruno proposed this pact that he was serious. Dead serious. You had made the mistake of speaking to a stranger on a train. And now, wherever you go, whatever you do, you find yourself dominated by his evil presence. And you, Bruno, to you, killing was the answer. Murder without clue, without motive. The perfect crime. Too perfect. And Anne, life looked very attractive to you, until the love in your heart became gripped by a terror that drew you deeper and deeper into this vortex of conspiracy.
To be double-crossed. I have a murder on my conscience, but it's not my murder, Mr. Haynes.
I wonder if you know how much I love you.
Brazen woman, I'm the one to say that. Haynes, hold it!
So welcome back. That was the trailer for Strangers on a Train. I'm here with Max and Nick, and now we're talking Strangers on a Train. Do you want to give us the plot synopsis, Nick?
Yeah, so Strangers on a Train is 1951 Alfred Hitchcock film starring Robert Walker and Farley Granger, with performances also from Ruth Roman and Patricia Hitchcock. Is based on the Patricia Highsmith novel, which I read 20 or so years ago, and did not, despite best intent, did not manage to reread in advance of this. So the plot is Guy Haynes, played by Farley Granger, is a tennis star with a political future, and he is on a train when he meets a stranger, dissolute playboy Bruno Antony, played by Robert Walker. Bruno is kind of a nut job and has what Guy believes to be a hypothetical conversation about perfect murders, because in Hitchcock movies, everyone is going to cost you with their idea for a perfect murder, and suggests an ingenious plot of trading murders. In this case, Bruno would get rid of Guy's wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, who was dragging her heels on a divorce, and Guy would in turn get rid of Bruno's father, who he hates. Guy doesn't think anything of this, but a couple of days later, his soon-to-be ex-wife turns up dead. And what follows is a super tense cat and mouse game between the two of them as Bruno tries to call in Guy's end of the bargain, and Guy sort of resists and gives in and resists, and it ends with a very, very, very technically brilliant explosion of a carousel, which we'll get to. Yeah, that is the story of Strangers on a Train.
So this one, it's very possible it could be even gayer than Rope.
That's funny that you said that, because that one of the, so like I said, I watched these again very recently, and I watched them within 2 days of each other, and I watched them in the order. I looked up when which one came out first, and so I watched Rope first, and then I watched this one, and so I was watching this one after kind of having had all those thoughts of, like we just talked about with Rope and how queer it was, and then there's the scene with his estranged wife, where she's just being like, she's completely fucking toying with him, and I was like, oh wow, I forgot Hitchcock hates women too. Like she's just this like absolute stereotype of an ex-wife, frankly. Mm-hmm. But yes, they're both just as gay. What's that actor's name? Farley Granger is in both of these, and as we just discussed, he had a secret relationship with Arthur Lawrence. So obviously, he didn't think Hitchcock was homophobic. I have to imagine that he knew.
Oh, yeah. I think he loved working with him. And, the trivia on this one is that Hitch and Robert Walker worked very closely together to get Bruno's mannerisms exactly right, to push as far as they possibly could. This is almost German expressionism again, like tunnels of love and strangling and hands and everything that you had already mentioned, Brian, that, it's a very...
it's just visually very stylish and mannered. There's a lot that is just sort of visually quite thrilling, but also fairly obvious. I mean, so there's a scene, the first time, right after Bruno has killed the soon-to-be ex-wife, shows up at Guy's place, and the lighting, they're separated by a fence, but the lighting is the shadows of the bars, and it looks like they're in prison. It's very stylish, but it is so on the nose. You know exactly what they're going for.
And we know what happens to boys in prison.
Yeah, it's like a Jean Genet story all of a sudden. Yeah. Actually, so my read of this, actually, like about halfway through the movie, I don't remember what exactly was happening in the movie when I thought of it, but I was like, oh, okay, so I get it. This is a metaphor for just like a guy who accidentally, like maybe not even accidentally, but like a married man who had a fling with a man, and now it symbolizes that. Like obviously it's about like murder and stuff like that, but like he's chasing him down like a jilted lover. Like you can almost kind of see a sort of a early gay like Fatal Attraction.
It's almost a blackmail movie,
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It just reminded me a lot of that like sort of spurned lover stalking someone. Also, one of the things that I noticed, and I'm reading this book right now called Cruising by Alex Espinosa, which is really interesting. So I guess I've had that on the mind. But when the movie opens, it's focused on their feet, and their feet bump into each other. And not that I needed this book to tell me this, but there's a lot of like foot sort of, while gay men are cruising, they communicate using their feet. And that was something that I noticed very early on, even before the movie had gotten started, because that's the opening credits of the movie, where he's walking and then their feet bump each other.
Unusually wide bathroom stance, I think they call that.
Exactly.
Senators have found out.
Right.
Exactly. And so I just like that. I thought of that, and I thought of how, like I said, it feels in a way like this jilted lover sort of blackmail story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something like really interesting in like the composition of this, the writing of it. Like there was a treatment writer apparently who kind of specifically adapted it so that it would kind of like reflect on some of like the Red Scare worries that were happening. You know, many closeted gay men working in the government at the time were extremely vulnerable to people with knowledge of them, sort of showing up and saying, what are you gonna give me to not reveal this to everyone you work with? You know, it was very dangerous at that time to be a professional closeted gay person. And I think that someone's intent in writing this at some point was to sort of draw those parallels. You know, the experience of someone who has a secret and what happens if somebody gets a little too close to knowing their secret and can stand to benefit from it.
Exactly. And I think that just goes right back to Hitchcock's like homophobia with like, he equates the murder with, in that metaphor, he's equating murder with homosexuality. Mm-hmm. And that to me is more further proof that he views queer people with contempt and like loathing and disgust.
But Nick, that's a great point that you bring up, and you know the writer that was brought onto this project, and we'll get into Raymond Chandler and some of those trivia stories in a moment, because man, is that fun! But this is another one, I think, just like Rope, where there was enough queer people or adjacent people behind the camera to start to give it the other meaning and to give it much more of sympathy and compassion and empathy, even with Bruno being a boo hiss style type of villain, than it could have been. And probably the center of that is that Hitchcock wanted William Holden as Guy rather than Farley Granger at first, which would have been a completely different movie. And Nick, I know that you're part of the William Holden fan club.
I am the William Holden fan club, Max.
I don't get it as much as you do, or kind of sexy, you know, kind of in that specific way. But he would have been it would have been much more clear that Guy wasn't gay, that this was not a metaphor, that this was not the blackmail type of plot, that we would have gotten a lot more probably of, you know, the Jimmy Stewart reaction to it, which is just like, this is wrong, and, you know, and underline it a few more times for the audience. But, you know, as Brian said, from the very beginning shot almost to the last, it's very clear that a lot of this relationship was somewhat mutual, you know, and doth Guy protest too much, but like the deed was done pretty early on. He talked to him longer than he should have. He did not shut down the conversation. Yeah, and that's basically our metaphor for like, yeah, they bang.
Guilt by association.
Guilt by association.
Yeah,
it's just shy of like lighting a cigarette and relief in terms of like signaling.
All right, so the Raymond Chandler stories, though, Nick, that's gotta be fun. This was his last credited screenplay, because obviously he was on his way out in his alcoholism and everything at this point, but he was brought on to do the second draft, and apparently that him and Hitchcock just did not get along. And in fact, when their third writer and ringer was brought in, Hitchcock made a show of holding his nose, throwing Raymond Chandler's screenplay in the trash, and them starting completely over. But this did lead to, probably in my research, finding my favorite Raymond Chandler quote about this, but that he said he preferred to work with a director that realizes what is said and how it is said is more important than shooting it upside down through a glass of champagne. And I'm kind of like, well, I suppose you're kind of right, but like, you're working with Hitchcock. That's the only thing he cares about.
Upside down through a glass of champagne. That's,
I guess maybe priceless. He's talking about Notorious.
I did watch, sometimes I do like some deep diving research before, believe it or not, I do research before talking about these movies. But I was watching a video on YouTube, and I watched a few on Hitchcock, and he had a bunch of those. And my favorite was that for that famous shot in this movie of the reflection of the glasses while she's being strangled, they just built a really big pair of glasses, and they stood over it.
Yeah.
Same with the big phone near
the phone at the end.
Was it that they just built a big phone, and then the camera like twisted just at the moment that she picked up a regular phone? So don't you love old Hollywood solutions to these?
I love a good practical effect.
Yeah, seriously. There was another one that they talked about. I don't remember which movie it was, but he wanted a glass of milk lit a certain way, so he just put a light bulb in it. Like, they put a little like mini light bulb. Yeah.
Suspicion. Yeah.
Yes. Nick and I went to go see that one at the Music Box too, and I think I bumped you, and I was about to whisper to you what you just whispered to me.
That sounds right.
There's a light bulb in that radioactive milk.
Yeah. To digress a little bit into Suspicion, and I have a point, and I promise if we don't get to this point, you should edit this out.
Have you listened to this podcast, Nick? Digressions are welcome.
Like, I do feel like there's something very interesting about like the Hitchcock effect on film and how it related to the Hays Code. And I feel like that is really like in the trivia of Suspicion, you know, Cary Grant famously is cast as someone who is maybe poisoning his wife. And famously, that film like doesn't exist in the form that it was originally intended to because the studio objected to the idea that Cary Grant would actually be a murderer. So there's like this like terrible like, you know, late stage reveal where no, he actually loves her. He isn't trying to hurt her. Which, you know, stinks to high heaven. But there's something really interesting about sort of, you know, the way that eventually, like, we get to a point where the studio machine and the star machine sort of dismantles as a result of performers sort of being cast against type in order to work for Hitchcock and to make really fascinating Hitchcock movies. You know, I mean, James Stewart eventually ending up in Vertigo, matinee idol Anthony Perkins being the queer killer of Psycho. You know, I feel like there's this like interesting like domino progression, and it might not have anything to do with Strangers on a Train, but I'm going to throw that one out there because it's interesting to me.
Well, this was another film where actors, you know, were putting a little of themselves on the line, you know, that Hitchcock was on a cold streak. He had already just done a movie about queer murderers, and Robert Walker, you know, who unfortunately passed away not too long after this film was completed. But this was another opportunity where like it could have gone all wrong, but this one ended up being a gigantic hit.
Yeah.
You know, and is still beloved to this day. And Robert Walker's performance held up, you know, as one of the most classic of the queer coded villains.
Yeah. And I guess he's playing so against type, actually, now that I think of it. You know, he's a romantic lead of the 40s.
But this is where I think some of the differences between Patricia Highsmith's, you know, and our grumpy lesbian or closeted lesbian type of approach to her stories and Hitchcock's much more campy and dandified versions make a big difference, because Bruno in this one is a dandy and a mama's boy and is very clearly this way. But that's not how he is in the book.
No, in the book, he is kind of a troll. Honestly, he's, you know, a rich boy who's never had to work. I mean, it's same for Robert Walker's performance, you know, about a rich boy who's never had to work for anything. He's quite young. He's very reactive. He isn't described as being particularly physically attractive. He just sort of comes off as sort of much more spoiled and petulant and childish without sort of the flamboyant sort of wicked edge that Hitchcock and Robert Walker sort of depict him with. He's much more sort of he's colder and more malicious, I think, is how he comes off on the page.
Mm-hmm. But I know a lot of critics agree, but like there is something to Robert Walker's performance that is very seductive. Like this movie is very much a pickup and a come on. It's such an odd performance and it's such an odd character, but like he is charming. You can see how you might get sucked into this accidentally.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see why when he invites you back to his stateroom for lamb chops and French fries and chocolate ice cream, you would want to go be part of that.
Yeah, I really liked his performance in this movie. He's definitely the highlight. And I think he's my favorite performance across both of these films. I thought it was interesting how in both of them, Farley Granger is sort of, frankly, the bottom, kind of put upon and
he's the
in
top.
Over his head.
Yeah, I mean, he really sort of found his place in the star system.
So I think this is a movie we were just talking about, you know, was a hit for a cold streak for Hitchcock. And I think the big reason is that I think it's one of his best directed films, really one of his top 5, tell you the truth. I think that he's made better films. I think he's made deeper films, but there's something to the expressiveness of his choreography and his big scenes in this one. You know, we talked, Brian, you mentioned obviously the famous shot through the glasses and influence there, but there are just so much love of going back to shadow plays of what takes place in the Tunnel of Love, or again, the ending of this film is one of my favorites of all time. It is one that obviously cannot be replicated to this day. And I think the trivia is well known that circus operator that's underneath that carousel, that's real. That's a real operator, and who's really risking his life. And Hitchcock said, well, I won't actively try to kill anybody in any of my shots moving forward from now on. But there is just something to that ending that is just completely wild. It is completely chaotic and just not what you'd seen out of movies before, or maybe even since.
You know, talking about the photography, though, the cinematography, it was actually nominated for Best Black and White Cinematography. And I think it's worth noting that Rope came out before this and was in color, and that this was in a period where you could kind of decide to do a movie in black and white or color. Yeah, there were separate characters, and Hitchcock famously went back and forth. And this movie definitely benefits from a lot of the black and white photography. You're talking about like the expressionism of it. I think my favorite shot in the whole movie, it's not the most famous, it's not the glasses shot, but it's where Guy is walking with the cop and he looks over and Bruno is standing there smoking a cigarette. He looks over and the building has a bunch of pillars, and he's standing between the pillars, and all these like shadows are coming down.
Yes, that's a great shot.
I saw that and I like gasped literally, like watching this on my HD TV. It looked beautiful.
Well, and one that always plays great on a big screen is the tennis match too. Talk about influential shots, but still gives me shivers up my spine, and just little joygasms as a film fan of watching the heads go back and forth, except for one. And as starts to pan in too, it's just, there's so much cheekiness, there's so much playfulness, there's so much love that's in this movie that I think that gets ahead of some of the homophobia we were talking about within Rope. That isn't exactly as campy as Rope either. Like, this movie is deadly serious, but it's also playful. It's very much in the mode of Bruno himself.
Yeah, it's a good read.
I love Bruno's tie clip. And how it just like completely gave him away at every turn. Again, they could have gotten away with this whole thing if he didn't have to wear this tie clip for his mother.
But then again, talk about somebody who maybe wants to get caught, and protests more than he should though too. Like showing how to strangle people at party, like losing that lighter all too easily, like having that tie clip.
Right.
Somebody who's just on the verge of wanting to come out and be known for being a murderer.
Yeah, both of these films feature like strange conversations at parties about murder. And I've been to a lot of parties, and I've never had.
No one has ever come up to you and said, "I have a perfect idea for the perfect murder. Do you want to hear it?" No.
Maybe I'm going
I feel like those are like always in Hitchcock movies. Like there's always somebody with an opinion about like, if I were going to murder somebody, I would do it this way. It's very charming and a little loses credibility after a while.
People were real drinkers back then, Nick. They needed to talk about something.
They only had like 3 channels. They didn't have like, there was probably not a lot to talk about.
You can't talk about the weather after 3 highballs, you gotta pick something a little bit deeper and darker.
Yeah, and the Hays Code probably wouldn't let them talk about sex. So, but one another sort of Hitchcock signature moment is the sort of strange relationship with the mother, and how she's kind of he still lives with his mother, and she gives him a manicure, and she takes care of him, and like again, I think that speaks to a sort of, like we've talked about, books have been written on Hitchcock's treatment of women. It's just another, I don't know, it feels like another trope, another queer trope that he's just sort of presenting and looking down upon.
Oh yeah, this is a fastball down the middle. I mean, the man's read his Freud at this point, where it's just a bad relationship with the father, way too close with his mother, didn't learn how to be a man. Again, this is not quite subtle, but also just, it makes Bruno a 3-dimensional character. It makes him more interesting than Guy. You care about him more. You like him more. Maybe again, this is for, a queer kid in the early 2000s watching this on VHS, from the local library. But like, again, there weren't a lot of other queer characters at that time. So we had to go searching back in the library and find them. And I still have this attachment to Bruno because of that. You're just kind of like, oh, well, there's somebody who's closer than his mother than a lot of these other TV. So, we're talking about the ending and the wonderful shots of the carousel scene and it really having this literally explosive ending. And then it just kind of peters out at the end. It's a happy ending for Guy and his new wife. Everything worked out well for him. It's all Bruno's fault. His sin and stain has been absolved by the end of the film, but that also famously wasn't the original ending in Patricia Highsmith's novel, though, right, Nick?
Yeah, so the book does include the Farley Granger character actually carrying out the murder. And as I said, I did not manage to reread it, so I don't remember whether he gets picked up in the end or gets away with it. It being Highsmith, I wouldn't be shocked if he gets away with it. She does love to set her gay characters into really intense moral quandaries and have them be responsible for terrible, terrible acts, and then sort of let them continue living their lives with the guilt of it if they want it.
Or maybe not as much guilt as they thought they'd have.
If you're Tom Ripley, then.
Which, Brian, you've promised us when the new Talented Mr. Ripley show comes out, we get to cover the Ripley movies.
Oh, good Lord.
Yeah, well, James and I talked about the Talented Mr. Ripley on X-rated movies, and I do recommend everybody go check that out. But yes, we will formally cover it for this podcast.
No, I'm just looking for an excuse to watch like Purple Noon and Ripley's Game again.
Ripley's Game.
I wasn't able to finish Ripley's Game when I tried watching it. It was a long time ago, though.
Too much malevolent, prissy John Malkovich for you.
No, that couldn't have been it, because I do love John Malkovich. I don't remember, to be very honest, why I turned it off, but I just remembered that I turned it off and sent it back to Netflix.
Well, we'll see if that Ripley show is any good. Max knows my feelings.
Yeah.
Andrew Scott's perfect. He's just too old if they're starting from the origin story.
If they're starting from Talented, then they should not have cast a 40-year-old.
Who did they cast?
They should not have a twunk when they need a twink.
Right.
Who did they cast?
Andrew Scott from Fleabag.
Fleabag, Hot Priest.
Oh.
I think he's perfect for like Ripley's Game era. Like I've said this to Max, like I would love to see them do like a Hannibal type thing where they spend a couple of seasons just like filling in like creating plot lines and stories and characters that Highsmith didn't write before they actually end up adapting any of the books. But I don't know, like I don't need anyone else to do the Talented Mr. Ripley. Damon, Law, and Paltrow are all fine as far as I'm concerned. And
Kate Blanchett.
Certainly don't want it. Kate Blanchett, thank you. No, you're right. It is a Kate Blanchett movie. Like
definitely, it's a Kate Blanchett. Now that's what I want: is Kate Blanchett as Ripley.
That would be phenomenal. Yeah, I would love to see a version of Ripley's Game starring Kate Blanchett as Ripley.
She can truly do anything. But we're getting way off topic, which happens sometimes, and that's fun. But I did want to talk about, because we mentioned her before, Patricia Hitchcock, his daughter, having a role in this film. And when I had first read about it, I had misunderstood that she was playing Barbara. I thought she played Miriam, and I was like, that's interesting that Hitchcock cast his daughter as the murder victim. But he did not do that. So
probably better. Probably better for their relationship.
Yeah. There would be so many books on that alone as well.
Right.
So
I love Patricia in this. I think that, there's a little nepotism. She gets some great lines. She gets to be weirder. She gets a little bit more attention than maybe that character would. But I think she's adorable in this. It reminds me of like, the female characters that Hitchcock does like in his movies do come with a lot of love and are a lot weirder, spunkier. And I think she fits that mode here.
Yeah, I really agree. Like it's clear that the movie thinks she's the smartest person in the room most of the time, and that reads. That translates really well in this movie.
Well, she's giving me she's giving me Midge in Vertigo vibes.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, obviously you're the smartest character here. Obviously you're the one that's got the biggest part. So that's why we're going to ignore you most of the time.
Right. But you're the one who's going to crack it. You're the one who's going to deliver the important information at the important time to the important person. Mm-hmm. Ruth Roman's just going to stand here and look beautiful and worried.
Which, again, famous, unfortunately, she was the target of Hitchcock's bullying on this movie. She was a studio star that was foisted upon him. He wanted somebody different, probably someone more blonde, of course. But I don't think I've ever seen any other movies with Ruth Roman before.
I think this is her major movie.
Yeah.
Same with... I actually found this interesting as a point of comparison between this film and Rope. For a filmmaker who is so famous for creating these like iconic female looks and centering like really iconic female performances in his films, or at least like creating them as a focal point. I think it's really interesting that, you know, we have Ruth Roman and we have Joan Chandler, who are not, you know, not big stars, not particularly thought of when you think of Hitchcock's women. I think it's a really interesting point of comparison.
These are kind of the two movies where it's like the boys, you know. It's
Yeah.
like these are kind of the boys movies out of his, rather than the iconic icy leading blondes. This is the ones with the iconic gay boys.
Yeah. You know, he's not even doing what he would do for brunettes like Bergman or Joan Fontaine in either of these movies.
Yeah, the girlfriend roles do not take center stage within these two.
Well, that's, I think, as much a product of the type of film it is and the era as it is the filmmaker. Like film noir and stuff like this, or murder mysteries, like there's always like the girlfriend character that's not really doing anything, but is usually, you know, probably smarter than everyone else.
I think they're both wonderful. I think they both do the part particularly well, and I think I'm just disappointed that he didn't make more of them or more of those roles.
Yeah, but a great double feature, and it did bring me back to 2007 at the Music Box, and to see them with Farley Granger, and to realize, holy shit, these are gay with a sold out audience was a special experience. And these movies, they retain their power. You know, I think that they remain popular and well loved and watched today because they are queer, they are weird, and they have dissolved all the rest of the baggage that came with them at this point to be really, really great cult classics.
It helps that they're the product of such an esteemed filmmaker, and that they stand alongside all these other great films that he's so known for. And I feel like we could do an entire like brand new podcast and just go through and talk about the queer shit in each one of Hitchcock's movies.
That would be beautiful. I'm so happy.
Brian, I really thought that you had covered Rope before this episode. That's why I did not pitch it for such a long time. I'm like, it's gotta be. It's such a cornerstone.
Yes. Well, it was one of the ones that in the very early days came up. And James and I wanted to pair it with Heavenly Creatures. But Heavenly Creatures is out of print and it's very expensive if you want to buy a DVD like on eBay or something. And I didn't want to do that. So maybe maybe a listener will have a copy and he or she can donate it to us. Honestly, who knows? I haven't been able to find a way to revisit Heavenly Creatures to cover it on the podcast. And then, because for the longest, I just wanted to do it with that. But enough time has passed that I'm like, well, I'm not going to find it. It's time to move on. Let's do Rope.
I'm so glad that we did Rope.
Yes, absolutely. I think between the two, I think it's my favorite. I honestly like watchability. Like, I feel like it's a movie I can put on and kind of have on in the background and like spend my day with, which is weird because it's such a dark movie about murderers, but it feels like, I don't know, like I want to go, I like revisiting this party. And whereas Strangers on a Train, I mean, obviously it's what you talk about is beautifully shot. It's great and it's well done, but it doesn't have that same sort of.
It spreads out. I mean, Max, you and I were talking about this a little. There's a bit of a sag to the middle of it. You know, you're sort of watching this cat and mouse, and sometimes there are some good suspenseful set pieces, but sometimes you're just watching people talk in quiet spaces. And that's fun, but it's not Rope. You're not watching the housekeeper very, very slowly like take everything off of the chest where the corpse is while you're hearing everyone's conversation just off a frame, which for my money is one of the best suspense sequences in that movie.
Yeah, his limitations really served him so well in a lot of that. I fall on the same side as you. I think Strangers on a Train is a better film, just technically speaking, and for the flourishes that are in that. But I've seen Rope over 20 times, and I'll probably see it 20 more times in this lifetime. It is just one of those perfect Saturday matinee, rainy day type of films like you just described.
Yeah, and my only problem with it is I wish it was anyone else other than James Stewart, who I generally like as an actor. But I just think he's all wrong for this part in this role. But who knows? Like maybe they needed a name to get this made, so maybe without him it doesn't exist. But.
We can do our own fantasy recasting, but now you've whetted my appetite, Brian. Like let's pitch North by Northwest and Psycho and Rebecca and
Yes.
Lady Vanishes.
Well, I'm sure I've
Rebecca,
talked to you.
please,
Well,
Rebecca.
I've talked to you about my because when I do Psycho, including the sequels and including the remake, is very queer because sequels were later directed by Anthony Perkins, and then the remake was directed by Gus Van Sant. And
you know I have a soft spot for that remake too. It's so bad, so miscalculated.
I know. And so for Psycho, I almost feel like we could do Psycho and just cover sort of all of those movies, like maybe like the way we did Halloween.
Oh, well, I'd be game.
And just, to talk about. And then what was the other one you mentioned?
Oh, Rebecca and Lady Vanishes. I think that'd be
that would be a fun one. Michael Redgrave.
Mm-hmm.
That's a gay character.
What about I had this idea. This was another one that we brainstormed, but I liked the idea, but nobody else did. But North by Northwest with Mission Impossible, the original, because Brian De Palma is I feel like Mission Impossible is Brian De Palma's North by Northwest.
I can see that. that.
But also, Mission Impossible is such a franchise at this point that it's hard to. I feel like it'd be hard to discuss that in isolation.
Well, we're the Martin Landau fan club around here. So.
Max, you're the Martin Landau fan club.
Yes, it's true.
I'm an honorary member.
I love him in Ed Wood, but I really think that Sam Jackson should have gotten that Oscar. Honestly, that was the year of Pulp Fiction, and it went to Martin Landau, who was great in Ed Wood, but Sam Jackson deserved an Oscar for that role. Well, thank you so much for coming on. But before we say goodbye, did you boys have a say something gay about these two queer films we've just been talking about?
Well, I'm going to take the easy option here, but I had a big crush on Farley Granger when I was a kid, when I first saw Rope. And there's just something so cute and vulnerable to him. And, these nervous, anxious, dark-haired twinks that I still, to this day, pay way too much attention to. Let's just say that his performances in these were formative for me. And he's just so darn cute.
I talked about this a bit earlier, but the sequence in Rope where the two women at the party are talking about the celebrities that they find to be handsome, no one but a gay man could have written that. So thank you, Arthur Lawrence. Even if we did have to have Jimmy Stewart throwing cold water and being a wet blanket on that sequence, thank you for letting us spend some time in a movie watching some women lust after James Mason and Cary Grant. Appreciated that.
100% gay brunch dialogue verbatim from that he just had at a pool party,
100%.
And James Stewart is totally the kind of guy that would be like, but wait, what about me? Not all men. For a movie about so many queer people, I find these two films, and generally Hitchcock films in general, to be really unsexy. I honestly watching both of these movies. I was like, I don't know what my say something gay is, and because Max, I knew you would be taking
Farley,
yeah. So that was a given.
How about John Dahl for you then? You can have.
Honestly, my say something gay, it doesn't always have to be sexual, and so my say something gay is going to be something queer, which is. I talked about it a little bit, but it really reads to me as much as I enjoy the films, to me they're very anti-queer, and I can appreciate them as a film fan, but as a queer person, it's hard not to notice that, and it's hard not to kind of think about that.
I get you, Brian. I suppose the way I still end this discussion on both of these is they're not Hitchcock's anymore, they're ours. We grew up with them.
Mm-hmm.
Young gay millennials and people for decades they've kept these films as popular as they are because I think they still have that historical value and the sympathy that not a lot of other films afforded them, and that protagonist status that these characters enjoy. But it's true, it's hard to wash that type of stink and homophobia off the both of them.
I think we have to be really aware that what we are watching is crumbs. Crumbs from the larger cultural table. These are the very, very small ways that gay people could be depicted on screen. And even, as much as we don't like it, this is what they had. And we can find something to appreciate, even if we don't want to, or we don't want to appreciate it. So, no, I hear you, Brian. I hear you, Max. I know what you both mean.
Well, and it was still another decade plus until we got Victim, right, Nick? Sympathetic portrayals were going to be a long way still.
I'm happy you brought up Victim because I was stopping myself from bringing up Victim. I think Strangers on a Train is a better version of Victim. But Victim is a better movie for queer people.
Yes.
I will confess that I don't know what movie you're talking about. I don't know this movie. I'm Googling it right now.
It is a 1960s British thriller starring Dirk Bogarde about a married lawyer who is accessory to someone else's gay blackmail plot and makes a decision to go after the blackmailers in court.
Oh, interesting.
And it's a decision that ultimately pays off. It's a very, very different kind of movie, very sort of boundary breaking, fairly sympathetic to the experiences of gay men who were victims of blackmail at that time, and really opened up a lot of different avenues for talking in a sympathetic way about queer lives on film.
Much more serious, much divorce from Hitchcock's wonderful immaturity.
It's not as pleasurable a watch, but it certainly made me feel better about myself. And Strangers on a Train.
Yeah, I think I was just reminded of something Max said very early on, and that's that Hitchcock is a bully. And that this is when I was talking, like, that's kind of like why I think I can kind of forgive how anti-queer it is, because he's a bully and he's anti-everything. And, you know, it's very much a case of separating the art from the artist and separating those beautiful shots and the technical prowess exhibited. He's just a bully picking on people. But yeah, these are both great movies. And I do love them, and I don't want to. And I'm consider myself a fan of Hitchcock. Like, I'm talking shit on him, but because I also think he's kind of a bad person.
It's what we have to grapple with. You know? He's obviously one of the greatest directors that ever lived, and he was a class A asshole.
Yeah. And these are the real, like, flashpoint movies for what we have to wrestle with. So I'm really happy to have had a chance to talk about them with you both.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. Do you want to hit us with your social media so we can follow you?
Yeah, absolutely. I am Mr. Autumn Man, Mr. MR, and it's all one word, no punctuation. Mr. Autumn Man on Instagram and Letterboxd.
And I am Max Bever on Instagram.
Excellent. I am So Brian Rowe. That's Brian with an I, ROWE, on Instagram, Twitter, and Letterboxd. I write reviews frequently on Letterboxd. And it is more, I make lists and things, and I have fun with it. So follow me on Letterboxd. Once again, So Brian Rowe, Brian with an I, ROWE. And you can find the podcast on Piece of Pie Pod, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Thank you so much, guys, for hopping on and talking Hitchcock with me. We'll have to do it again, honestly. We'll find another pairing and we'll make it happen. In the meantime, get vaccinated. If you're not vaccinated, get vaccinated. And if you are, thank you. And we'll see you next time.